One thing you may not know about me actually is last year Clipping invited me to join remotely, which I did. So you would have seen me up on screen, but what you didn't see was that I was in fact sitting at my dining table, and down the other end of the table were two of our children having their breakfast, and my dog was sat down trying to follow what was going on. So we'll crack on. VUCA, this idea that the world is more volatile and uncertain and ambiguous, and comms and media, Martina said comms and media contributes to that. I actually think comms and media is the cause of that, and the changes in the media ecosystem and the way we communicate and the way audiences communicate with each other is an actual cause of this uncertainty. Okay? What is uncertainty at its core? It's a lack of reliable knowledge. And there is only one thing that causes a lack of reliable knowledge, and that's lack of communication or miscommunication. That's it. So that puts the ball firmly in our court. And we see it in politics, but we see it at company level, we see it at product level. If you're selling shampoo, you believe your shampoo is great, but does the market and do your customers believe the shampoo is great? Well, it all depends on their experience and what they're told. So communication is so very important to everything that's going on in the world now at all levels. First, a word about me. That's me there, and I'm pretty much wearing exactly what I'm wearing now. But that was actually taken a couple of years ago in Prague. As Martina said, I'm a lecturer at the University of Westminster. I have to say, this is very reminiscent of being in a lecture theatre at the university, although it's a lot smarter. And if I can say, the audience is a lot smarter. I'm also director of media analysis for Newton Insight. I used to work for Kantar, which is owned by WPP. Kantar is, I believe, still the biggest media intelligence company in the world. Before that, I was TNS. And before that, I was co-founder of an agency called Presswatch. And one of the things, we're talking about today are changes over the last 10 years. When we were back at Presswatch, all we needed to do was, get media clippings, newspaper clips, radio, TV clips. That was it. Back then, there was no social media. The job was a lot easier than it is now. And I suspect that the job for communicators was possibly easier then, or more certain then, than it is now. When we were talking, Martina, Divna, and I were talking about some of the things we could address today, we eventually started talking along a nautical seafaring theme of whales and small fish. The whales really are the media we know, whether the newspapers, the TV channels, the great big fish in the sea that are very noticeable and who we partner with in order to get ourselves noticed. Obviously, the way media has fragmented over the past 10 years means there are fewer whales, but there are more small fish. There are millions of small fish that we have to engage with through digital platforms. We all know the statistics behind the decline in some mainstream media channels. This is just the UK, and over the past 8 years, newspaper readership in the UK has halved. Now, that would be a problem but what intensifies the problem is that shifts in media are not equally spread. It's generational, it's influenced by demographics, and you know, the problem that all mainstream print media has is the fall off in amongst younger age groups. Just recently, and it's not just newspapers, just recently there was a very popular women's magazine in the UK, Marie Claire, which ceased its print publication. So this is a glossy lifestyle, fashion, cosmetics magazine whose lifeblood was glossy advertising, and it's had to pull its print publication and go fully online. Not to make more money, but just to stop losing money. So it's not just the FT, the Times, and the big newspapers that have this problem. It is at the B2C lifestyle section as well. Over the same time, we all know there's been a massive explosion in digital and social media use. Okay, so as our whales have decreased, the fish in the sea have increased exponentially. The maths on this, for all of us sitting here, is less of what we know plus more of what we potentially don't know equals confusion. There is a further mathematical equation that says, in our confused state, the fact that we need to prove the value of what we do more than ever equals even greater confusion. And this is the challenge we have now. We are expected to be more certain about the value of communication than we've ever been at a time when our media world is at its most uncertain. It is an unenviable situation for the PR and comms community to be in, and it creates several challenges. And we're going to discuss some of those broader challenges today. One thing to kick off with is that maybe some of the personal skills, the personal experiences that have served us well in the past will not serve us quite so well today, when we need to know empirically, we need hard evidence to show that we know what's going on and what the value of our communications is. Gut, you know, that mix of your own sense of things and your own experience won't really cut it in today's world. And this creates the first change and challenge to discuss today, which is how PR needs to become more accountable when we are less certain about our media environment and what our performance might be within that environment. Historically, you know, everyone who comes here and talks at the Clipping conference needs to have a little word about AVE. I think for many years, there really wasn't a demand within organisations for PR to validate its existence. It was seen as something that provided a shop window for organisations and brands, and so long as that shop window was full of good, positive coverage, no one really thought to ask what this coverage was actually worth and what it contributed towards the business. So AVE came about really as a way of measuring the size of the shop window, of measuring PR output. It was never about outcome, and it certainly wasn't about value. All it could be said was that it was about cost. It was, this is what the cost of the advertising would have been. Now, I once spoke with a CFO. He was an American CFO, so he kind of spoke like that. And he said to me, Phil, here's my problem. AVE that's advertising. They're going to save me the cost of advertising, but I was never going to spend that money anyway. So, I'm being asked to accept that AVE is saving me money that I would not have spent, but the PR agency is going to charge me a fee for it anyway. Which is good. That really is what the problem with AV is at just a basic logical level. You can argue, well, it's good, it's a sort of, it's a euro sign of some kind, but logically it just doesn't work. And I think most people get that. And what's happened now is a whole series of other metrics have come into play. Now they're all valid, but they all serve different purposes. And I guess the challenge for us is, in our quest for validation, is that there is no one metric, no one silver bullet that we can put in front of our stakeholders and say, that is the value of PR. Now, talking about money, something that I've sensed has happened maybe over the past 5 years is this demand for PR to have a hard ROI, a return on investment. I'm going to disagree with that. I don't think it is the job of PR to have a euro sign or a dollar sign next to what it can do for an organisation. One of the greatest strengths of PR, and something that only talking to people can achieve, is building not just brand health, but brand resilience. And you will never see the value of brand resilience in the good times. The value of brand resilience comes in the bad times. If we think about some of the things that PR does do that are measurable, here are just some of 3 columns of ways in which PR and communications can positively contribute towards an organisation's resilience. You can expand the audience that knows about you and build awareness. It's a simple thing and it is measurable. But through your creativity, you can also make yourselves memorable to that audience. Hang on, just got to go back. And once you are memorable, you can start to build affinity and preference. Not everyone can afford, to undertake NPS, Net Promoter scores in quarterly or annual waves, but through customer surveys, through CRM, through every time you have a touch point and engagement with a customer, you can start to build up a good view of what they think about you. You'll see on websites, every time you go to a customer website, sometimes a micro survey will pop up. How would you rate your experience? Or how do you rate us? 1, 2, 3, you select. They're just building this up over time. And once we have affinity, it starts to create preference. And this is where it starts to have, communication can have a very definite impact on, the path to purchase. As we move through consideration. The last 3 really are about resilience, ideas. So this idea of your brand, that people start to share the ideas that you are communicating. If you are in government comms, NGO, not-for-profit, you are not necessarily selling anything other than an idea that you wish to influence the behaviour of your audience. You want them to recycle more plastic. You want them to use public transport more. You want them to stop smoking. A euro sign will appear in terms of the social value of that, but it won't be attached to your campaign. Ultimately, it's, you want an action, you want a call to action. Now, in the commercial sphere, yes, that is the path to purchase. But in so much more around communications, it's wanting people to think differently about you. And that's what creates brand resilience. To give you, a really simple example of this, most people in the room will at least have heard of Manchester United, the Premier League team. This season, Manchester United are having a shocking season. They are just above relegation, and yet they are still the biggest football club on social media in the Premier League. Not by a little bit, they are twice the size of anyone else. Now, we've been tracking all the Premier League clubs at Newton Insight for the past 3 years. No other club, not even Manchester City or Liverpool, who are doing very well, is getting even remotely close to the size of Manchester United on social media or the level of engagements that Manchester United has in social media. Now that's a really simple example. If you remember, if we think about brands that maybe lack resilience, if you remember, I think it was in 2016 when there was a passenger pulled off a United Airlines flight, and that went viral, and it had something like 4.5 million shares on social media. We were doing a report on airlines at the time, and we considered, why did this go viral? Obviously it was very dramatic, it was very emotionally charged, but I think part of the challenge for United Airlines was they lacked resilience. And if you look, what interested me wasn't the spike in coverage that happened when that video went viral. It was how negative social discussion about United had been growing over the previous year anyway, because of customer service issues, delays. Basically, the passengers were falling out of love with United Airlines. And the communications team at United, if they'd looked at that, they would have known that they are increasing the risk of that a major reputational incident would have disproportionate effects. And that is indeed what happened. So this idea that communications, it needs to power our brands and our organisations, but there can be both good and bad outcomes, creates this second broad challenge, I think, that everyone in this room can think about. And this is this move from communication to negotiation. Now, this is something that we discuss at the University of Westminster. I'm sure if you did sociology or media degrees at university, you will be familiar with reception theory popularised by Stuart Hall in the 70s. That basically there are 3 stages, there are 3 possible reactions to communication. There is a preferred reception, I agree with what you're saying. There is the opposed reception, I reject what you're saying. Or there is the third one, the negotiated reception. I understand what you're saying, but I'm going to understand it with my own bias. So that will change your message to the message as I understand it. And I think that really is what so much of communication is about these days. We communicate our message, but how people receive it is down to them. And this brings into play the fact that people are receiving media messages in many, many different ways. If we go back to when the whales were in the ocean and we dealt with the newspapers, if people receive their news mainly through newspapers, that's what they know. So if we deliver a message through the newspaper, it is unlikely to change substantially. But now we deliver a message, and there will be many, many different other opinions on what we're saying entering the news feeds of the people that we're talking to. So the message becomes distorted and it changes. The biggest, simplest negotiation we have is simply to be noticed. The whales did the job for us. A big daily newspaper or a TV channel immediately had a readership or an audience of 1 million. That was great. Now, in my day-to-day work, we see big brands getting reach on Facebook or Twitter in the hundreds. The post just doesn't go anywhere. And the regular changes in algorithm mean that very often, just when brands understand what they need to do and what they need to say to achieve a good audience engagement, they are sent back to square one. And the result is that rather than developing organically, you have to start promoting. And more of your PR and comms budget, rather than going to building good media relationships and good audience relationships, starts going on Facebook Ads Manager. There's an awful lot of PR spend now in the UK that is being redirected away from what we might call classic communication and into essentially what are adverts. If we think about how these changes in media actually impact our audience, okay, so now it's not just about how we understand newspapers and TV and social media, but in terms of what the daily exposure to media is, we can see that really things have shifted further away from classic media models than maybe the 50% decline in circulations tells us. This is the Global Web Index report. That's free to online. They did a fantastic job. It's fully global, so it looks at all parts of the world, and yes, Slovenia is in it. And as you can see, that in the top there, that's 7%. Actually, I'm going to come over here because I'm blocking off that bit for everyone over there. You can see that that's 7% at the top. That is what's left of the entire print press. So only 7% of a person's time is spent with print. And most of that will be commutes to work. In the UK, our two most widely read newspapers are the Metro, which is given out free on trains and buses in the morning, and the London Evening Standard, which is given out free on trains and buses in the evening after work. If you take those two out of the equation, you are taking probably 1 million a day out of circulations. You're probably taking 10% of the entire UK national newspaper market out of the equation. The other interesting thing is that before, when we think about competitors for our message, for our profile in media, we've always looked at share of voice in terms of media, pure media. Whereas how consumers, how our audiences are investing their time in media is very different. It's computer games, it's Netflix. There's so many different paths to media content that our audiences have nowadays. So really looking at it purely in terms of a media share of voice, I think, isn't really giving you a full sense of what's going on. Now, we all know that one of the reasons for this issue for us is just the amount of new content that's coming out. Okay, so 3 hours of YouTube content every minute, 100 million photos on Insta every day, 3.5 billion searches per minute on Google. This means that in terms of new content, the days are getting packed. The problem is we didn't get any more time in the day. So what's happening is content is being ignored. And it is being ignored at quite an alarming rate. For branded content on Facebook, audience engagement rates halved in the space of 1 year. Okay, so this was the big BuzzSumo and Buffer study that was released last year. They analysed about 50 million branded Facebook pages. And they noticed that over the course of a year, average engagement rates went down by 50%, and they are continuing to fall. Now that's for organic content. If you promote, then you may be able to maintain some engagement. But I don't think the answer for PR and comms is to become advertisers. Advertising already exists. We do not need to reinvent it. This is the Edelman Trust Barometer, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. That looks at now, we've got that negotiation over being noticed. We've now got to negotiate being trusted. And this is where all those issues around media credibility, fake news, misinformation start coming into play. And this is where you as communicators, if you are consistent and you are honest, this is where hopefully you can start to stand out. Because in uncertain times, people will appreciate your certainty and your consistency. But this is where there is better news for traditional media. And I think this is something that we understand, that over the past 2-3 years, people have been returning to trusted sources of information. So traditional media and search engines have the highest trust. Traditional media, because of editorial credibility and authority. Search engines, because what search is effectively a mass peer movement. Google calculates it via all the searches that we do in this room and everyone else does. So it sort of bubbles up as a natural front of mindness for the global population. Social media and own media are both sub 50%. So, this is one of the, we spoke about Facebook having, engagement halving, but also trust in what people see on Facebook or on Twitter is only 43%, which is very, very low. People are more likely not to trust than they are to trust. Some simple guidance on what we can do to try and not become part of that. Most of it is common sense, I think, being keeping up to date on things and relevance and reaction. Actually stepping into the shoes of our audience and thinking, what do they need from us? Remember that negotiation. Historically, PR and comms has been very good at talking about what we want to say. But sometimes we really need to stand back and think, right, what would our audience want to hear from us? How can we help them understand us better? Standing where you are. So far, a lot of the talk about evaluation and validation is about us knowing or defining the boat we're in and the performance of our own organisation. But I think one area where everyone in this room can have added value to your organisation is to be the navigators, to help steer a path through choppy waters, to understand where the rocks are in the sea. Because a lot of people within your organisations, they are media consumers too. They will have an idea of how your organisation or your brand is perceived by virtue of the media they read. They will not know what's out there, in the much broader media ecosystem. But you can help explain it to them. You can, the CEO won't know this. The CEO, she will know what she reads in the newspapers, she will know what she sees on TV or what comes in on her smartphone, but really what are the possibilities outside of that, and what are the potential risks outside of that? In 2016, there were some people in the UK who realised that the real potential of communication was not in knowing where they are, but in really understanding the sea better than anyone else. That's these guys, the Leave campaign in Brexit. That's a chap, well, that's Benedict Cumberbatch playing a chap called Dominic Cummings. So if it's possible to...
This is just for suspense.
Yeah. Okay.
Everyone knows who won, but not everyone knows how.
You're about to ask the biggest question a nation has asked itself in a generation. In or out? It's going to be pretty nasty.
I will get us across the line whatever way I can.
Dominic Cummings is an egotist with a wrecking ball.
We have to hack the system.
Hack it. You turn up for 5 minutes and you think you know the law.
This is just a game to them, but the risk to you...
There's no risk, there's nothing to lose.
3 million extra voters that the other side have no idea exist. You are kidding me. This should be an amicable contest.
Total war.
They can say anything they want with zero consequences.
Trumpets, please. Let's take back control. There is a new politics in town that you cannot control.
Benedict Cumberbatch in a new feature-length drama, Brexit, the Uncivil War, Monday the 7th of January on Channel 4.
Okay, if you haven't seen it, I urge you to watch it because it's probably, there have been academic studies about what happened to the Brexit vote in the UK, but that's probably as good a retelling of this particular story as you are likely to see. The fact is...
Boris Johnson looked surprised and a little shaken hours after vote leaves
Right, the fact is, the entire media and political establishment in the UK got Brexit wrong. This wasn't a simple case of an occasional mistake. It was a universal misreading of the public mood, of the sea. People had been sucked into believing what was being read in mainstream media. Why? Because the media itself believed that it knew what the mood of the country was, and they simply did not know. On the eve of Brexit, on the 22nd of June 2016, I said in a post on social media, the size of the Remain vote will surprise many people. And boy, were we surprised at the size of the Remain vote. It wasn't exactly what I meant. So I was half right. But I stayed up overnight. And here's the interesting thing. I stayed up overnight watching the results come in. And sure enough, in all the towns and cities, all the metropolitan areas were heavily Remain. But then all the outlying areas of the UK started to come in. And one by one, leave. What Cummings had done was he had identified that he called it the swing fifth. That there was about 20% of the population that was basically invisible to politics and media. Just people who lived in small towns and villages throughout the UK that no one really noticed or cared about. Leave decided to care about those people. They were heavily targeted, with Facebook ads, etc., but more so with the messaging that was being delivered through the mainstream media. What Leave had done was understand the sea better than the Remain campaign. The Remain campaign accepted the assumptions that we had always followed, that these things would be decided in London, Liverpool and Manchester. And it was by looking beyond what we know and into the realms of what might be possible that we arrived at Brexit. And just to underline that point, this is a study that was done in June, just before the Brexit vote, when the Political Studies Association asked various professional groups to make a prediction about how the referendum would go. And if you look, it's quite small, but if you look along that line, 97% of journalists said we would remain. the whales can no longer be relied on, not to tell the truth, but to be accurate. And that changes the situation. Trump understands this. You know, he worked out that rather than negotiate with the whales, I will negotiate with the millions of little fish on Twitter. I will bypass mainstream media and go straight to the people. In fact, I think just when I said at the start of this that changes in media have affected uncertainty and ambiguity throughout society, I actually think changes in media are directly responsible. Well, they're one of the reasons why we have this rise of popularist politics. Is that the safety valve of a strong, vibrant, independent, but mass reach media. Because that media is not so powerful now, we have populist politicians of both left and right going straight to the public, of which Trump, love him or loathe him, has proved himself a very good exploiter of. So in the wake of what happened in the US with Trump, in the wake of what happened with the UK, with Brexit, there's been an explosion in primary research, reconnecting with the people and trying to understand how people think, not how the media believes they think, but how people actually think. Voter questionnaires, online panels, mass observation. One of the biggest online panels is maintained by YouGov. It's got about 250,000 people on it, and every time they detect a change, it is widely reported. And the issue that YouGov has uncovered is that largely things have not changed significantly over the past 3 years, that we've been having this huge argument internally in the UK about Brexit. At Newton Insight, we maintain our own study on this. We launched it in 2017 and it's still going on. There are over 1 million posts about Brexit every month. That's not retweets or comments, that's original posts by people with something to say on Brexit. So there's 1 million a month, 16 million so far between January and September this year. What we do is we monitor the output of 2 million citizens on Twitter so that we can understand how they are feeling. There is free to download a look at the Brexit mood. I'm not going to spark this one up. Looking at the next slide, one thing we were asked about, when we released some results, there was a community on Reddit who said, well, is the problem that people who voted leave are just unhappy anyway? And that really, the vote leave is just an expression of their unhappiness, rather than a properly constructed political narrative. And so we looked at that, we segmented everything we had in our database, which was at the time, about 4 million tweets, by people who spoke about Brexit against people on Twitter talking about anything else. We sampled 1% of the UK's total Twitter output for a year, just to get a barometer on how happy or angry people were on Twitter. And the good news is it was about 55% happy, people tweeting, it's a great morning, I've had a great cup of coffee, or here's a picture of my dog, just happy tweets. And then there was the angry, sadder tweets. For the UK population, it was 55-45 happy. We then looked at people who spoke about Brexit, and as you can see on the chart over there, it's 2/3 unhappy. Okay, so these are people who generally like to complain about things. And you can see that where they under-index is for happy, positive emotions, and where they over-index is for all the negative emotions. We parse out tweets and look for emotional signals within them, okay, and then segment them according to those emotions there. what I'm going to leave you with is our latest results for September and another prediction, seeing as I got the last one quite so wrong. So you spark that up, Martina.
Suspense.
Yeah.
Suspense.
That's great. Thank you very much. So this is just a dashboard. It's absolutely free. It's online. You can go and look at it. So that top chart shows you how Twitter activity has been ramping up throughout the year as we move closer, as Theresa May, our Prime Minister, resigned to be replaced by Boris Johnson, as we saw extension after extension because we couldn't agree amongst ourselves what we were going to do. And so it's correct up to September the 19th. If we look here, you will see that the two dominant emotions are mistrust and anger. The important thing to bear in mind is we are not looking at this through the lens of leave or remain. We just want to know whether people are happy or angry about Brexit. Now what we can then do is map that against events. If something happens that is very supportive of Remain, and we see a big change in, positive emotions, we know there are more Remainers in the Twitter audience than there are Leavers. Whereas if Boris Johnson comes along and says we are leaving on the 31st of October, do or die, and there is a big spike in positive emotions, we know there are more Leavers in the Twitter audience. So that's how we're calculating the approximate proportions of Leave v Remain. And the reason we're doing it that way is because one of the conclusions of the 2016 referendum was that voters weren't telling the truth to themselves. No one, people would say, oh, I think we should Remain, and then they'd go and vote Leave. And that this had been part of the problem, not just for the media and for politicians, that people were basically lying to themselves about what they were going to do. So we just use these emotional expressions to try and, get under that. So the key chart is this next one. Is it possible just to scroll down the page? Right, that's it. So that bottom chart shows the actual volume for each emotion over time, and you can see how it expands and reacts to different events that happen as far as Brexit goes in the UK. But it's that chart above, that 100% stack, that's looking at the proportion of each emotion. And as you can see, we fluctuate in terms of volume, but in terms of emotional signal, that has remained remarkably consistent this year. Now what that's suggesting to me is, for all the talk and for everything that's been said and done in the name of Brexit, the British people are still split 50-50. Whatever happens in Twitter is going to elicit an equal Leave and Remain reaction. So the idea that suddenly the UK population realises that Brexit is a tremendous mistake and we've all swung behind Remain, I don't think, unfortunately, is true. So the prediction to leave you with is that if there was a second referendum, we would end up with the same result we had before. It might change by a few percentage points, but we could only have a second referendum if it was going to result in a decisive decision either way. Anything else, anything around the result we had last time. Even if it was 55% remain to 45% leave, it still wouldn't be accepted, it wouldn't be good enough, it's still too similar to what happened last time. It would need to be, I think, you know, a 2/3 majority before people started to accept that possibly leave was wrong. I just need to go back to the presentation just to finish up. All I'm doing is getting to the last slide. There was no more. When Clipping asked me to come and join you today, there are a million things we could talk about change. We haven't spoken about AI. We haven't spoken about technology. That can be the subject of a different discussion. We haven't spoken about influencer marketing. So many things that are changing in the world. But I just really wanted to tackle some of these big things about how we, maybe understand our changing world. I've spent over 23 years doing this stuff, and sometimes you need to travel a long way to reach a simple conclusion. And the conclusion I'm just going to leave you with is, there are many, 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 many things you could do. There are many technologies you can use. There are many methodologies you can use. There are many demands on your time to look after mainstream, to look after social, to look after brand health, to look after the CEO and the corporate reputation, to handle employee engagement and internal comms. There are many, many things you can do. In terms of how you validate those, you really have to boil it down to what matters to you, what matters to you most. And that means you don't need to create a long shopping list of things you think you should measure. You just simply need to measure the outcome of what you are looking to achieve. And this is something that we're going to talk about in the workshop, which is how you can really understand the performance against your objectives. What Leave did was they understood what they needed to do. They needed to do one thing, really, and that was engage the swing fifth, this missing 20%. That's where they were going to find the votes to turn a marginal, or what looked like a minority, into a marginal majority. Anyway, that's me. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you to Clipping for your hospitality.
We're not quite done yet.
Okay.
Maybe we have some questions.